All right. Welcome back to Overengineered, the podcast where we ask the question, what's the absolute best way to do things we already have a perfectly acceptable solution for? Today, I am back with Bogdan Kharchenko and Skyler Katz, and we're going to be hearkening back to the early episodes of Overengineered, where I started this podcast with this concept of like, there are these things that we talk about and we never have time to actually like really just dig deep and come up with a really great solution for because they just don't matter that much. And I feel like the show has shifted over the years away from that some, but I still want to have those conversations from time to time. So we had an opportunity arise, and I thought we'd get into it. But before we do, you guys want to say hi?
Hello. It's good to be back.
Hey, Chris. Hey, everybody. Thank you, Chris, for inviting me and Skyler back on the show. We are the OG. If it wasn't for us, I don't know where your show would be today, Chris. So it's great to have
it wouldn't exist without you. Yeah.
Exactly.
You're welcome.
You're welcome.
All right, let me set the stage. So we have this like sort of programming architecture, database architecture question that we want to kind of work through, which is when you have tables that hold big blobs of data, right? So we have a couple of use cases. One is a table that holds the contents of large documents in it. And others are tables where we're holding base 64 encoded image data. And in both of those cases, the amount of data at the individual row level is not that insane, right? The base 64 images are, small cropped images of a black and white signature. So it's not that much data. But when you compound that over many, many rows and a couple different tables holding this kind of data, it starts to add up. And in the other case, we have this table it's got 1.5 million rows in it. It's not an insane number of rows. It's not an insignificant number of rows either. But each one of those rows contains an entire document in it. And just operating on the table is a little bit clumsy. And if you have to take a database dump, it takes a long time. And if you need to import that database dump, it takes a long time. It's just a little awkward to work with. And we're also seeing this with verbs events. If we fire a ton of verbs events that have large chunks of data attached to them, now our verbs events table is getting kind of large. So it's a problem that we've bumped into a bunch of times. It's a conversation that's happened on the verbs Discord a bunch. How do I fire events that have files associated with them, which maybe those files could be even larger than what we're talking about. And right now, verbs doesn't have a great solution to that other than I just tell people, put the file in S3, set up some, permissions on that bucket such that the files can't be easily deleted and associate and attach reference to those files in your event. But anyway, there are a couple different ways to approach this. Starting from we just don't change anything and it's fine, going up to a very involved but very clever solution that I think I've come up with, and I thought we'd run through them. Is there anything that I'm missing?
I don't think that. I think those are. Those are the two ends of the spectrum, I suppose.
So, I think that this is a problem that probably a lot of people have bumped into in different ways, right? It's very convenient to have relational data. I actually, before I get started on that, I do think there's one other relevant piece of information, which is in almost all the cases that we've been talking about internally at InternetChi, it's been data that we care about for a specific period of time, and then it becomes less and less likely that we'll ever need that we'll need to pull up the larger parts of the data later, right? But we still need to keep it around, and we still may need it. But it's like, in the case of the documents, it's like, while the document is active, we're going to be loading it from the database regularly. But then those records are mostly just used for aggregate queries and sort of directory listings and stuff like that, and not necessarily shown or queried ever. So there's an element of sort of time to the way we're thinking about it that I think comes into play, where it's perfectly feasible to potentially like sort of offload that data somewhere else after a certain period of time, so that we can keep the database size and sort of like keep the database nimble, but still have like quick, immediate access to the data when needed. So that just feels like one other relevant detail.
Yeah, so one thing I wanted to maybe talk about a little bit before we get into the weeds of your over-engineered solution, Chris, is kind of the issues that we're having, right? It's, we're trying to just with our ORM query a few hundred records or a few thousand records. And because we have to pull this additional column every time, it's just, slowing things down because it is doing like an IO read of that data. And I just kind of want to set the stage of like what we're actually dealing with, and I think like one of the ways that we've been combating this so far is explicitly asking for certain columns from our database in our eloquent query. And and it's great, but I think like it is a little bit tedious where you have to say like, yeah, of course I need to get a created as column and the some other column, the user ID column in like 6 different places is just not ideal. So
and it's easy to forget as well. Like maybe you optimize a bunch of different queries and then you add a new feature and you don't remember, I have to explicitly select columns with this particular model. It's just like not an obvious thing to keep track of.
Yeah, totally. I mean, we've obviously just been experiencing that by grabbing too much data, and the query, even though it's very fast and it's all optimized, but because it has to get all this data, it's just super slow.
And it just doesn't, it's not fun to write that code when you're like, model query, you've got all these things and you're like, I gotta add a select with just an array of like column IDs. It just isn't, I don't know. It's not Laravel.
It's not eloquent code.
Exactly.
It's true. It's true. Yeah.
I do think, I know that there are people who sort of take a different stance than I do on this stuff, but my general rule of thumb with Eloquent is try not to heavily optimize until you need to, because those optimizations always come with some cost. And oftentimes the upside is minimal, if any, and the downside is like you're going to spend 3 hours debugging something because in this one place you happen to like decide not to fetch a column and it's the error is not like showing up in some way, or you're like, your relational query is scoped somewhere else and you're not getting the data back that you're expecting, but it's like not an obvious thing. I just find that the more you can just do straight queries with Eloquent, even if it's a little bit less optimal, the better your life is going to be. And then you optimize them when you actually start to see a need. Or, there's some cases where it's like, okay, I'm going to be operating on every single record in this table. And I only need the ID. Of course, I'm only going to like query just the ID in that case. But in most cases, you just don't need to do that. And it makes your life so much better. So I think you're right, Skyler. Like, it just sucks to have to do it all the time, basically.
Yeah. I've run into situations previously where like I've selected columns and then I'm just like, oh, it's null. Like, why is it null? Oh, because in the part where I was fetching the data, I didn't select that like new column that I added. And
right.
Pain.
Yes. And then the default Eloquent behavior is it just gives you a null, and you don't know, is this actually null or did I not request this data, which there is a way to prevent. But
yeah, I was just gonna mention that, Chris. I didn't mean to cut you off. There is a way to turn that flag on, so that way your application blows up a little bit when you try to do that. But still, I agree. It's non-obvious. It's painful to work with.
Yeah. So there are a couple of simple solutions to this problem, or simpler solutions to this problem. The most obvious one is just, move the heavy data to another table, right? Query it when you need it. You can even query it through joins so that you can still treat it like a regular attribute on the table and just use a scope to join it in when you need to. And that way it's sort of like an opt-in instead of an opt-out. Maybe you throw an accessor on there so that if it's not loaded, it lazily loads it, and you could throw some sort of exception if it was an n+1 situation. I'm sure there's a way to tie into the default Laravel behavior there. And I think that would solve a lot of the problems, right? I mean, frankly, that may be the solution that we end up reaching for because it's pretty simple, and it doesn't require us to reinvent too much of the wheel. It doesn't solve a bunch of the DX problems, though, because it doesn't really, you still have 40 gigs of data in your database dumps if you need to like pull that backup down.
Well, and I feel like
just means, you've got separate tables now that you're dealing with, right?
You have separate tables, but also, I mean, even in the verbs events context, like you would have to have, like, weird stuff would happen if you don't end up with a record in the other table where the blob of data is supposed to be.
Right.
And so, like, if we had an articles table and the content was in some other table, but for some reason it didn't get written, like, you just end up in a weird place too, with things potentially getting out of sync.
Right. Yeah,
which isn't resolved by your complicated situation either. But
I mean, I will say, yes, there's an extra table and there's maybe an additional join, but this is like a pattern that everybody's used to. You just have this belongs to relationship or has one relationship, and you call it a day, right? This is like a very known pattern. And we do these types of relationships, not necessarily for a specific like blob column or, a long text column, but they exist, and I feel like developers are used to that. So yes, there could be some instances where something goes south and that thing didn't get copied over to that additional table. But I really think that could be mitigated, and I just think in general people are much more comfortable with that type of offloading of data into another table. So
yeah, I mean, it's definitely more straightforward.
Yeah,
for sure.
Totally.
The downside, I mean, I think the big downside for me, or the thing that makes me think that at least in our use case, it's not the right solution, is verbs. Because either we have to introduce some sort of like special, I guess we could create a new table called like verbs heavy data, or I don't know, some other table that we make clear is also part of verbs. And just sort of internally treat that like the event store, like this table can't be messed with. Or I don't know what the solution, unless we did some weird, we would have to do some weird stuff with verbs, right? We'd have to maybe push that data to, first we'd write that data to this other table, and then we'd fire the event and reference the ID of the other. I don't know. It just feels pretty bad when you get into the event sourced side of things, to have something that's so separate from the event sourced, all the other event source data, but is so integral to it. That's my take, at least.
But I mean, it sounds like in the case of verbs specifically, the event data is very crucial for making sure the event state is basically built up correctly, right? And I feel like, I don't know, maybe I don't fully understand the problem with verbs, but there is obviously also a large chunk of JSON data inside the table, and it's basically really unneeded unless you're replaying the event, right? Is that what I understand?
Well, yeah, and even if you're replaying the event, there are lots of replays that you might do that never touch the document contents, right? So in the
Sure.
case of these
Oh, I see.
documents, it's like we have a document created, document updated type events,
Hmm.
and right now we're projecting that to the database, but we may want to project to some sort of analytical tool as well in the future. And most likely for all of those projections, we don't need the document contents at all. So being able to quickly and efficiently fetch all of that data without having to get that big blob of contents that we don't care about, which in this case we can't exclude because it's a JSON column.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, I guess we could do some really crazy like JSON subquery type stuff, but I don't know what the efficiency of that looks like. And I don't know. Yeah, I'm just not sure what that would look like. Um,
I mean,
I see. I
and I
maybe
understand.
imagine that no matter what, like InnoDB still has to fetch the JSON contents, right? In the case of a long text, um, InnoDB is putting that contents on a different page, right? So if you don't ask for it, there's like literally no performance overhead. Whereas with JSON content, I can't imagine that that's the same. I could be wrong, but I can't imagine it's the same.
I mean, in verbs, when we're serializing the data down to store it in the database, could there be some thing that verbs does where it's just like this JSON is large, or like a key is large, and it's just going to like uh, within verbs dump that somewhere and just store a reference to it in the data column
Yeah,
and then
I,
pull it back
I
out, just like sort of behind the scenes so that the end user has no care in the world about it.
yeah, 100%. I mean, I would like verbs to have a built-in solution. It feels bad for us to like put together some sort of taped on extra thing that we do on top of verbs. It feels like, we it would be so much better if it was something that was built in. And like, we already have the serialization deserialization pipeline in verbs, so like it's the type of thing that could be handled fairly transparently. Um
Just
it
put an
does feel
attribute
like,
on the key in the payload or something and
yeah, exactly.
just
Yeah.
ship it off.
Yeah. But whatever it is, I think it just feels like creating a separate like big contents table that's just like a UUID and a long text and just like referencing that UUID somewhere uh feels gross. If it weren't for verbs, I think I could live with it, but with the way we do verbs, it feels a little gross to me. I'm not necessarily opposed to it. Um because it does, the simplicity side of it is really nice, right? Um, but yeah, it just feels like not great.
Yeah. So I guess here, let me kind of step back a little bit. So, like, one of the things that we want to solve with potentially the software engineer solution is not just the query performance, but just not having to always ask for all of the data if you're just needing like a small little column in like the verbs JSON payload, right? Because what you're saying is in the verbs JSON event payload, you would just say like, I just want this and this key rather than the entire like document that's attached to it. Is that what I understand?
Yeah, I mean, I think you would essentially wrap the data behind some sort of abstraction that
Mm-hmm.
has a way to retrieve the data. And until you retrieve it, it's like the thing that makes me think of is when I was exploring Swift, there's like the concept of wrapped variables where it's like when the variable's wrapped, you don't know if it has a value or if it's an error, and you can kind of pass them around, and then in the code that actually cares, it unwraps the variable and then deals with sort of the consequences of that action. Um, so it was kind of that idea, like you'd pass around some sort of object that if you never need the data, all you're doing is passing around a reference to an object. And then the moment you need the data, either the object would already have the data, or the object could load the data, or the object could throw an exception if for some reason the data wasn't there, right? Um, and I did a little bit of research, and the term for this is the claim check pattern. And so this is like a relatively well established pattern in applications that deal with lots of big data payloads, where you essentially have a system where you exchange some data for a claim check, which is just like some metadata, and then at any time you can exchange the claim check back for the data. But until you need it, you're just passing around like a UUID or something like that that represents the data, and you only need to load it if you need it. Um, and I feel like you could implement this with a database table. You could implement this with something like S3. You could put it on the file system if you wanted to, although you probably don't want to. But like, um, it's a nice sort of generalized pattern that solves this problem of just like, let's offload this and only get it if we need it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I've obviously heard you talk about this already, and it sounds very, promising. I do want to feel like poke at this a little bit more. Maybe if you dive deeper, I'll find some holes at it. But it just seems like maybe in bulk operations, retrieving data with this claim check somehow. I feel like maybe are you going to be back at the same spot as storing data on the row itself, so like if you just had the JSON blob in that, or whatever, the content in that event, and if you have to rehydrate this thing with some claim check from another table or an S3 bucket in real time, I mean, are you just back at step one?
Yeah. I mean, it's 100% a trade-off, right? Like
Okay.
essentially you're trading the the optimizing for the one case for optimizing for the other case. And the downside of the like sort of traditional claim check pattern, or just, I mean, the other thing that we could do, like we do with other file system related things, there's lots of tables that we have that are related to a file where we just have a disk column and a path column, right? And you just
Hmm.
load those from the file system as needed. And I think the claim check pattern has that same downside, which is every time you need the data, you have to load it from this secondary store. Um, and so the solution that I had proposed before we got on this call was the idea that, well, what if we still had a long text column on this table, and we just write the data to the long text column as usual, and then we essentially, we implement some sort of trait or attribute or something that you can put on your model to describe, or some sort of, you'd probably use like a custom cast,
Hmm.
to describe which data should be handled in this way. And we run a scheduled job every day. Um, and like, if I'm stepping back and thinking about this more as like an open source package and less as just like a solution that we're going to use, because the advantage of implementing some sort of open source package is then we can also adopt that as sort of the canonical way to do this in verbs. Um, we could just have a scheduled task that runs a command that essentially discovers every model that has this cast. And sort of like Laravel Scout, you could optionally, define a method that tells this job how to efficiently load the data. And you could optionally, implement a method that tells this job how to do the logic of when things should be moved to, like, what I'm calling cold storage, right? So by default, maybe it would be any record that's older than 7 days or 14 days or 30 days or whatever it is, gets moved to cold storage. But like each model could separately define its own internal logic. And that way you might say, okay, if this like document hasn't been sealed yet, then it never moves to cold storage. But like the moment that it has been sealed and is more than 30 days older, it moves to cold storage, right? And so what moving to cold storage would be is we grab the contents of the record, we write it to S3, and we replace it with some sort of JSON payload that says, this is the path, this is the disk, this is the path, this is like the timestamp that it was last accessed, perhaps. And well, that's a thing that I haven't quite figured out. But essentially, it would swap it out with a reference to a file in S3, right? But then, since we're using a custom cast, when you try to access the attribute, essentially, Eloquent would just say, like, okay, well, if the contents is there, just return it. So for all of the stuff that's sort of in the hot path, the stuff that's in the last 30 days or whatever, that long text column is just going to have the contents and it'll just work like it does right now. If it's not in the contents, the cast can just exchange that claim check for the value in S3. And we could even have drivers. There could be a database driver, an S3 driver, and a DynamoDB driver. Who cares? Like whatever. And so transparently, you could just access the contents as though it was always there. And for the content that is most likely to be needed, it will just be there. And for the content that has been moved to this like cold storage concept, it's just one additional call to S3, but it's transparent to the application, which has a lot of appeal to it. The downside is that now, we're back to those records are always being loaded no matter what. So it doesn't solve that first problem that we talked about, right? So it's not a perfect solution to that, but it's an interesting solution to a lot of the other problems that we've faced.
I mean, what's the downside to just getting rid of the column in the database altogether and just storing it in S3?
Right. So just always storing it in S3.
But then
in the context of these, even in the verbs events context, like there's a small performance penalty, but it's also, I just don't think it's that small if you're hosting your application in
right.
AWS
We're on EC2.
and S3.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you were like on Laravel Forge's new boxes and you were using R2 from Cloudflare, like this stuff is so close to your box that like I just don't know that there's really that big of a performance penalty to pulling stuff that's like not accessed that much. I mean, and these documents are accessed several times over the course of a week and then probably never again until somebody decides to look back up for like historical purposes at their document. And then you just pull it back in. And in verbs, like we don't use verb state. I suppose if you were doing mostly state stuff and you needed to hydrate all of the events every time, like that would come at a cost.
Yeah. No, I think because the like cold storage concept doesn't address that first issue, which is that you're having to like manually handle which columns you're loading. It doesn't feel like actually a great solution to our problem. I do think that maybe abstracting that behind a concept called a claim check, right, where there is like a an object that you get back, that like you can pass that object around until you need it, and then the moment you need it, it either has already been loaded or can be loaded dynamically. And that would provide a way to potentially say, like, if you're storing your claim check data in the database instead of S3, you could eager load that stuff, or maybe there's a way to even like load multiple records more efficiently in S3 in a single call. But I do think that maybe just a simple, like, okay, here's an S3 bucket that's only for this. It's got restrictive policies on it so that the data can't be deleted, and we just store, essentially a UUID that is a reference to that file. Could be, it could be the best option.
I mean, I've never used it, but S3 has like a way to query S3 files like in a SQL-like syntax. And I wonder if the file was stored in a certain way that you could just like pull them back. Which would be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing that kind of strikes to me is like, for example, obviously if the file exists only in S3, like you kind of lose some other, you trade off something else, right? Like you can't do like JSON queries, for example, on that column, even if you've had some data hydrated. Like you can't do a text search, for example, of whatever document. And one thing as you guys were discussing this that came to my mind is, and maybe Chris, you touched up on this a little bit. If there was a table called claim check that had some sort of long text column and it had a UUID or an ID or whatever, that is the thing that you've exchanged somewhere else, right? So there is this like relationship, and that kind of solves that issue of having to limit or explicitly say which columns you want to fetch from like your main model, because the content is just in another table, but it ultimately will end up in some sort of S3 bucket, but still there's like a direct reference to that column in this table. And you don't have to basically query everything all at once. And if you do have the warm data, you could maybe do some sort of searching or operations.
Could put the warm data in a claim check table, and then that table takes old records that haven't been claimed, accessed in a while, and dumps them off to S3 with a reference. And
well, that's basically what I'm describing.
A custom relationship where if you're eager loading, we just then fetch the content from S3 and push it back into the model when you're grabbing them.
It almost doesn't even have to be in the model, right? It just, this is a relationship. A column. It's just a relationship, right? There's just this claim check.
Yeah.
And whatever it is, you can change a cast to it or whatever you want to do. So I don't know. I think
like that. I like offloading medium. That data to the database also solves like because the problem with, or like the most complicated piece of this like cold storage idea was having to auto discover all the places where you need to look. But if you just had all that data in one table, then that scheduled task could just run every day and just grab everything that hasn't been accessed in more than 30 days or whatever, you just configure it and just offload all that to S3, and that could be a totally optional process, right? You could choose to do it or not, right? You could turn that off and just keep the stuff in the database if that's what you wanted. Or if you were concerned about the size of your database tables, you could offload some of the data to S3 as you needed to.
Yeah. I mean, there's a like storing data that's rarely accessed in S3 is going to be cheaper than storing it in RDS.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also
of a penny per hour, but
yeah,
Sure.
I think there's also like the savings in data storage will probably be offset by like access reads and writes to S3. I don't know how much it costs, but it probably is also very minimal. But I think like the solution that we're kind of like I think going after is dealing with large data, right? And maybe when you scale up to 10 gigabytes and 20, 30, 50, 100 gigabytes of data, then it actually makes sense. But like if you only have like 1 gigabyte of data or 100 megabytes, which even that is a lot, I think just keeping in a database, like if somebody was like, here's this package and you have to use S3, and I'm like, oh man, that's like another thing I got to maintain. But if I just optionally can say like, oh yeah, well, this is kind of where big blob data is stored, and I'm okay with the cost because I have 2 users on my applications, me and my wife. But I think that's super appealing, just to have a specialized table to hold some of this bigger size data.
Yeah, I mean, that's another thing that like is pretty common in this pattern is just having a data size threshold. So that could be another thing, configuration option that we could offer and tweak for ourselves, where it's like, yeah, if the size is over X, don't even write it to the database, just go straight to S3, because we don't want to put like a gig of data in a blob column. You know what I mean? Yep. But as long as it's under some number of kilobytes of data, write it to the database first and then archive it to S3 later once it hasn't been accessed for a while. Like we could also implement something like that. And that would give us sort of the best of both worlds. You could essentially write whatever amount of data to one of these things and just know that it's just going to be sort of transparently handled for you.
I like it.
Ship it.
There we go. We solved it.
Chris already wrote the
rare
the
occurrence.
code.
37 minutes, and we just solved the problem.
Yeah. I mean, it's all, I think on paper it looks good. I know that, actually implementing this and working with this long term is going to prove to be challenging no matter what. I'm sure that there's probably, table partitioning that we should think about, or maybe as you're writing this package, like how to automatically partition by date. I don't know if it's necessary, but it's, could be worth exploring because, if you say to me like, yeah, here, this magical table is going to store millions of records. And then, at some point it's going to come to a grinding halt the same way some of the other tables that we've been dealing with. I don't know. It has to be, I think time proven, but I think it's a good premise of doing this. And obviously, we didn't invent anything, like you mentioned earlier. This is like a common pattern for storing data in like long-term storage, cold storage with this claim check concept.
I mean, there's one other thing that, like when we were upgrading our database, the person for Percona was like, you can, in MySQL, like you can make a shadow column. Like the column is there, but when you do select star, it just never returns it. You have to like explicitly say, like, give me the content column, which could also be an approach for some of these tables where, and then we just have a query scope that says like with big content or whatever that adds the select star comma select content to the query. Like that's an option instead of having to remember to do all of them. I don't know. Or like an attribute that, I don't know, makes a second query to the table if you're trying to access the content column, but it's not there. It's like,
I mean, I really like that simple
potential
solution,
approach.
Skyler, but I think it's not over-engineered enough.
Well, I mean, the downside to this is that it's opaque, and you're like,
Yes.
why do I have to say with content? Like, you still get that same problem of like, I did a select star, but it's not giving me back all of the data that I'm expecting.
Well, I mean, I would go further to say the problem is that it doesn't solve two of the major headaches that we are specifically dealing with, right? It does solve the one, it solves the querying problem, but it doesn't solve the size of data when we need to do debugging. And yeah, and it doesn't like it's still that, I mean, ultimately the data is still just in that table, right? All the problems that are around the data being in that table remain. Just because it's not being selected by default, like, makes it slightly better, but it doesn't actually address the fact that like that data is still there. And I mean, for context, so one part of our development process at InternetGy is we have a job that runs every day that takes a production database dump, restores it, runs a bunch of sanitization and cleanup on the data, like anonymization and stuff like that, and then exports that to dumps that to an S3 bucket that we can then use for local development. And like we just are, when we introduced this feature, our database dumps went from 5 gigabytes to 40 gigabytes overnight. And that's just like a real frustrating experience, so that's like another piece of it that I do want to address. Right now we're just sort of clearing out the contents of those tables, and we've got that dump size back down to even a little bit smaller than what it was before, but it comes with the trade-off of like, now we don't have any of that data if we're debugging locally.
One thing I wanted to add, Chris, that unfortunately we still deal with sometime is, what you just said about, basically we kind of don't get that content because we clear it out. But even with this mechanism, right, we would then have to take an S3 bucket, potentially backup, and sanitize that data too, and make sure that it's available for our development environment. So it is another trade-off that, right now at least we can say like, oh yeah, well maybe we should keep 1 week worth of data, right? And it's all kind of there contained. But if we have a place where we're offloading it to another bucket, we have to clone that bucket as well, and do that same kind of sanitization process on the data, so that way it's available for like local debugging and development. And that's just another challenge that
we could do something similar to what we do with Stripe, where we have the read-only key for pulling in like the Stripe billing stuff, where if we try to write when we're in local, it'll just throw an exception, because it's like, you're trying to write test data to the prod, but you're able to like read the prod transaction history or whatever. So we could have a read-only production key to S3 that's like, all right, well, here's the claim check like read key, and in local, like, it can read from there, but it would write,
but it can't write to it.
It can't write to it. We can overwrite the production stuff. I mean, I think like, at least with Stripe, when we're pulling in customer stuff, it tries to find it in our dev instance, and if it can't, it reads from the prod instance.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is, if we do this sort of like two-phase, first it goes to the database and then it moves to S3, essentially then it's only an issue if you're trying to access data that got moved to S3, which in a lot of cases theoretically wouldn't happen, because like it's content from years ago that you're not likely to need for local debugging, right? So I do like the idea of like optionally supporting some sort of like alternate read key for the claim checks, so that in your local environment you could set it up so that it's like, yeah, if you don't have it locally, there's a way to access a claim check, a production claim check locally. But I don't even think you would need that most of the time, because
I mean, that's like special
data
to
would just be in
our
the database.
instance. I don't know that many people that just use their production database dumps as their local.
I mean, I think that more people than want to admit do.
It's true.
I don't know many people who publicly say on the internet that they do it, but yeah.
It is pretty interesting. I will say one other thing I noticed the other day. I was on Twitter, and I think Tim McDonald posted that they migrated like 6 billion records in their ClickHouse database, like in their staging environment or something like that. And I was just like, man, that's a lot of data, right? And and I'm not saying let's go use ClickHouse, but I think it's worth maybe investigating if some of this type of data could be suitable in some of these column store tables, because it seems like that, like Nightwatch, for example, itself stores a lot of data, and they're constantly sorting it, querying it, by time. Like show me this exception, or list of exceptions by these timeframes. So I don't know if that's a potential solution or another, a can of worms potentially. But I just thought that I was like, man, that is a lot of data. As having us just gone through a minor migration in comparison. 6 billion is a lot of rows, and I suspect that they are also quite heavy. So just some food for thought.
I don't. My impression, based on what I know of like ClickHouse and similar databases, is that they are not optimized for returning like a single record by ID, right? They're there for like very efficiently doing aggregate queries on data. And so it's kind of like a different trade-off. I don't know that that is the right solution. I do think that there's probably, I mean, what was the one that you brought up the other day?
The Parquet.
The
but
Apache project.
But I believe from what I understand that S3 is built on top of Parquet. And I think, Skyler, what you were referring to as far as that SQL language, I think that is that Parquet, whatever's querying language. And I could be totally wrong, obviously. Do your own research. But, I've just heard that name in various contexts of dealing with data store, and it's like S3 and all these R2 buckets that just all seem to be wrappers on top of that project.
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. Oh, go ahead, Skyler.
I was going to change the topic a little bit.
All I was going to say is, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if like S3 is their own custom thing, but that like, if we wanted to run our own version of this database, we could, but I am happy to just use S3 and not run our own, bespoke database that's for these large chunks of content. You know what I mean?
I mean, this would not be helpful for verbs events, but the things that we're running into are like we're storing, but the base 64 encoded basically like signature doodle canvas drawings, and like maybe we should be storing those on S3 as PNGs to begin with. And then these like documents that are HTML in nature, like maybe they also just should have been stored in S3 as HTML and loaded client side, or still just like pulled in with file get contents. Like maybe these particular use cases aren't actually, the database isn't the right place for them. It doesn't solve the verbs events thing, other than we then wouldn't be storing the document in verbs events, and in these tables we would store a reference to the document in the verbs event, because we'd have to push it to S3 first, but then we lose versioning of these documents unless you turned on versioning in S3. So
I mean, I think that ultimately that is probably true. I mean, I think that the reason that we're storing right now, the reason that we decided to store these base 64 encoded pings the way we are is because we are fundamentally interacting with them as base 64 data that gets used in a JavaScript component instead of like loaded as a file. So I think that that's why the approach was the way that it was, but like in hindsight, I think that there's a good argument for these 5 or 8 tables that have these like these columns that just have a ton of data in them, like they should probably all be offloaded from the database, in some way. Or at the very least offloaded into their own table in the database so that it's like, or tables, maybe one per. I don't know exactly what the solution in each case is, but it's like probably something that mostly looks like a file should be stored in a place that's mostly made for things that look like files.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I agree. I feel like there are, I always hear sometimes like on the internet, it'd be like, oh yeah, like we have like 20 megabytes of images in our table, and I'm like, why would you ever do that? And then just looking back at what I did last week or 2 years ago or whatever, we do the same thing. It's just the scale hasn't caught up to us.
Yeah.
And now it has, I suppose, and we're kind of like, oh yeah, of course. Why would we ever do that?
And then we're just like, oh, another program that needs these canvas signatures.
Yep.
Let's just create another table that each table doesn't look too big.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes those are just the decisions that you have to make in the moment. And ultimately, I mean, a lot of these things are not really problems.
They're only problems when I open Table Plus and I'm trying to look at something.
Well, that's because they're using Table Plus.
Well, Queryus is also just slow and spins on this.
Yeah, they were problems. They only became, this is the first time when we hit a real problem, which was when we were doing these big queries where we're processing thousands of records and we're loading, an entire document's worth of content in each record. And we were able to address that, right? Like all of this is mostly manageable through just the solutions that we already have. But I do think that there is a better option that like we solve this once and then we just have a solution to this type of problem. And arguably we're at the point where, okay, we've hit this enough times. And like I said, it comes up often enough in the Verbs Discord, like this question of what do I do with an event that has like an image, like an avatar changed event, like what do I do with that? And that's even worse than like that's even easier because it's not that much data, but like a, video queued for processing event where you've got like a 30 gig 4K video, right? That you're trying to add to some data pipeline, but you want to run it through an event source system. Like Verbs should have a solution to that problem. We're actively having this problem in Verbs for ourselves. We've had to think creatively about how to deal with events and files in the past already, and this is like a case where we're dealing with it even more. So it just feels like, okay, we've hit this point where a better solution is warranted. And I like this like sort of two-phase claim check concept where it goes to the database first and then gets pushed off to S3 as appropriate. And you kind of, the thing that I'm not certain about is it better to like hide that whole process behind a cast, or do you just have a cast that returns a claim check object and make the consuming code have to be sort of like quote unquote claim check aware, right? Where it's like you get a claim check and you have to explicitly exchange it so that like you kind of understand in the consuming code what's happening, or do we do that transparently?
I think this is where I was referencing a custom relationship, because if we had a custom has one relationship, we could, in the relationship logic, we can say, well, is the attribute in the database column, or is it a claim check? And if it's a claim check, then fetch it from S3 and just return back the content like in the custom relationship when it's doing its matching.
Well, would you do that? Or you could also potentially do something where like in your custom relationship, it like tries to load all the data, and then if it's not there, it actually like inserts the data back into the database.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is also something that you could do, because then it's accessed again. So
right.
It would
so then it goes
insert
back
it
into the
back
hot
in,
path and
it would go back into the
eventually
hot
gets
path.
moved off. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting.
Like it all just happens transparently. I feel like all these file system calls have to get like wrapped in, retries and all sorts of stuff that like S3 is notoriously, well, all file systems are notoriously just like flaky.
Right.
This is the other unfortunate downside with some of this. It's like when you insert it in a database, you almost have like a guarantee it's there, right? Like a very high chance, especially if you do like a transaction.
Yeah.
And, but like when you're pushing stuff into S3, now it's going over the wire, even if it's, located in the same data center, like things happen. So that's just certainly something to be aware of.
Yeah. And I do think that that's another argument for if this was an open source package, like we could collectively, because I'm certain that there are other people out there who have the same problem, like we could collectively improve the resilience of that to make it less likely. But it is true. I mean, you're, fundamentally writing to a database or writing to S3, it's like there's a chance for either of those to go wrong. But yeah, with transactions and like, all the stuff that we have built around interacting with the database in Laravel, like you have certain guarantees that we would have to make sure we were like getting the same assurance with another solution.
Yeah.
I like it.
Does S3 do any like, is there any way to do like checksums or fingerprinting on S3 or like some sort of data verification?
Well, you can pass tags, like you can pass keys, metadata in. And so you can then get that metadata back out when you're fetching an object. I don't know with Laravel's, just with the file system adapter, if you're going to get all of that in one go. Well, and I actually am not sure that you can get it in one go. I'm pretty sure it's like a get metadata call, even with the SDK.
Yeah, but if it's a background job, there's not that much load, right? If it's just offloading and you're just storing, making sure that the thing was stored and the checksum matches, I guess on the retrieval that could be an additional call.
If we wanted to go crazy, we could always like write it to S3 and then read it from S3, and before we delete the data from the database, like it's running in a background process.
Right.
So we could choose to be inefficient there for data integrity considerations. And there's also like, building in encryption at rest, that would be relatively straightforward to do in a system like this. So that would be really nice. Yeah, I don't know. I like that. I like that as an approach.
Yeah, it seems interesting, and I mean, in our case of dumping out the database, like having the claim check table that has a handful of days of big content, and then the rest of the records are all just paths, keeps the whole database size smaller.
Yeah. Well, ironically, we've now solved the problem enough for ourselves that we don't necessarily need to go and implement this solution now. But I like I like that we came to a good place with it. It feels like a good solution.
Chris, do you have any train trips coming up? You're just gonna like train induced development of a new package?
Yeah, no long train trips on the horizon, unfortunately.
Me and Skyler are gonna have to sponsor you and send you off to, I don't know, Alaska on the train or something.
Oh, God, what a nightmare!
Well, Bogdan's going to be gone at the convention this week, and so we're not doing anything. We're just Bogdan's working hard,
God.
and then we'll just work on claim check.
We'll just noodle around. There you go.
I like it.
Oh man! All right.
Awesome. Well, I think this was cool.
Yeah, I like it.
I think we came to a good conclusion. I think I feel like aside from like coming to a conclusion, I feel like all of us have recognized all the trade-offs, right? Because all of this stuff has trade-offs, whether you're inserting directly in the table, offloading somewhere, and so on and so forth. So I don't know. For me, I feel like pretty good about seeing the reality of what this would potentially look like. If we go about it.
I mean, and also just to be clear, Claude, and I quote, says, no, where did I put that? It's a genuine innovation opportunity right here that we've got.
You're absolutely right, Chris. Yes, do it.
God.
Yeah, I'm sure Claude could just write all this code in
oh my God,
an afternoon. It'd be fine. Just
easy peasy.
Look, Verbs 1.0 hasn't been tagged yet, and it's you have an opportunity here to get claim check in.
Just sick Claude on it.
Exactly.
Let's introduce a poorly written, buggy version of claim check. All right. Well, before we stop, Bogdan, you had your meetup recently. How was that?
So I just had my Upstate PHP meetup in Greenville, South Carolina, October 9th. So we're recording, I believe it's October 14th.
It's the 14th, yeah.
Yep. And it was awesome, man. We had 5 speakers scheduled to talk, including I was going to do a presentation, and I did. One of the speakers, unfortunately, was called out sick, but still we had a pretty jam-packed event, and we had over 20 people show up. And I don't know. I love doing these meetups, and I like talking to people. I'm like, I mentioned this to you guys before. I'm like always surprised how many new faces I see. People are just like willing to connect, and I know not everybody's able to come out to all these things regularly, but as far as like the new guys, I mean, they just keep showing up, and it's super awesome. And then after some time, they tend to be regulars. So I don't know. I'm excited the fact that I started this, and I'm excited that people are still coming and sending me text messages the next day and saying, "Dude, I had such a great time. Keep it going." So it was a really great event.
And then there's PHPX Atlanta now, right? You went down for that?
Yeah. So Jace runs PHPX Atlanta, and I went down there maybe 3 weeks ago, and he is also trying hard to organize and finding a permanent venue spot. I think that's one of the challenges that Jace is having right now is he has to swap to different places. But he also has a pretty good turnout, and people are getting together. There's a bunch of old timers, it seems like, in the Atlanta PHP meetup. People who have been attending the Atlanta PHP meetup for like 15 years, 20 years. They have like a pretty long history of people showing up. But yeah, I mean, it's super awesome to go down there and hang out with them as well. And it's relatively close to me, and I told Jace I'm going to come out to all the events that you have, because I just want to support him, make sure that because when you show up, that's actual support. You know what I mean? And I feel like a lot of people get hung up on like sponsorships or all this other stuff, but like if nobody shows up and you have a fully sponsored event, you didn't. It sucks. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But if you have people showing up, even if you're losing money on it, I feel like it's a good time. So yeah, I'm excited to visit Atlanta for all the meetups there too.
And Skyler, do we have another PHPX St. Louis on the horizon, or is that slowed down for a little while?
It slowed down for the summer, and then Mark Binder, or my co-organizer, was just moving. But we've been texting about the next meetup. I think we're going to do like a November, like a happy hour,
Nice
meet and greet to hang out and regroup, see where people want to travel. The St. Louis region is quite large, and a lot of people are coming from all over the region, and so we're trying to find a good central location to meet up with.
Yeah, I came back from Laracon like all energized, ready to do another meetup, and then life got in the way, and I still haven't scheduled another PHPX Philly. I went up to New York for the PHPX NYC last event, and that was really fun. But I'm hoping to get another PHP Philly started soon.
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna say first off, I want to come to the next PHP event sometime, and I was actually talking to Stephen Fox. He was visiting the meetup I just had, and we were kind of low key talking about crashing the PHP NYC meetup one of these days. Just kind of show up unannounced, so watch
That'd be
out.
awesome.
But yeah, I don't know, Chris, if you're the only one pushing the meetup, but you need to find a co-host who can do this scheduling for you, and then you just have to show up, or do some of that legwork. Because I know it's hard for, to get motivated to schedule, put something on a calendar.
Yeah, we've got a couple people who are involved that I probably should sort of invite to be a little bit more involved in that piece, since it's such a challenge for me. And I'm actually, I'm talking with Matt Stauffer. He wants to come up and join for one of the meetups, maybe do a talk. And Ian Landsman is planning to come down at some point for one of the events too. So we've got a couple like bigger names in the industry who folks would want to come see that I'd love to have do something at one of our next events. So if you're in the Philly area, keep an eye out. And just in general, if you're listening to this an hour plus in, you will definitely enjoy going to a local meetup. So if you're not already a part of one, take a look, phpx.world. There's the laravel.com/meetups, I think it is. There are a couple others that I can't think of off the top of my head that have a good list of events. And yeah, I mean, like Bogdan said, if you can show up for one of these events, it means a lot to the organizers, and it's going to be fantastic for you. But I don't know. It's just been so much fun to be involved in like these events, and I love to do it.
Yeah, same. It's a rush, honestly. I think after the meetup, I couldn't fall asleep for like 2 hours because I was just pumped.
Yeah.
But I just know a lot of people had that same energy. They were just chit chatting and getting to know each other. But yeah, I highly encourage anybody to, even if it's not a PHP meetup or JavaScript, whatever you're into, just go do it. I think the in-person energy is worthwhile.
Yes, they're tons of fun.
Yeah. All right. Well, with that, this has been fun. I'm glad that once again we have just solved the problem. Case closed. No further action needed, and we can just move on.
Just feed this transcript to Claude. Let's go.
There you go.
All right, Chris. See you later.
All right. Thanks, guys.